Hi, this is my colleague. I contributed to the UK's National Broadband Plan and Strategy between 2010 and 2012. Lost my position in 2012. I identified a significant and abnormal inflation of costs in the procurement process and begun reporting this matter in the spring and summer of 2012. My efforts were leaked in September and appeared in the newspapers, after which I lost my position. This is a summary of the efforts taken in the last 7 years to reverse what I consider to be a significant abuse of power by a small number of executives in BT, a place I happily worked for 22 years. This is not an anti-BT rant, but a pitch for more transparency. Any gaming of costs and capital appear to happen at the expense of engineers, customers, and the long-term interests of shareholders. I'm doing this now because my resources are running short, and there's still a significant amount of capital, about 500 million in my opinion, to be tracked down and converted into deeper coverage in rural areas. I believe another 600,000 rural premises could receive full fibre from the programme initiated in 2012. This would have a fundamental impact on any subsequent transition to full fibre, as big swathes of the most difficult areas would be already completed. The good news is the amount of progress that has been made in the last 7 years. Some 7 million premises have been passed, quite a few of those in urban areas. There's even better news to come if the outstanding matters I outline are addressed. The gambit, as BT folk sometimes call it on online forums, had 3 elements: the inflation of costs, the consequential withholding of BT's capital contribution. The third element of clawback was more of an unknown at the time. All evidence I reference is a matter of public record, either UK Parliament, national audit functions, or BT recorded representations and BT quarterly results statements. It's obviously subject to my opinion on top, but the evidence is there for you to judge. And so the first piece of evidence is on June 12, 2012. BT made an unambiguous offer of 1 billion investment to match government funding for the rural programme. This is yet to be fully reported on. This is 7 years later. The 2.5 billion has its own controversy, as BT withdrew full fibre from 2013. As it stands, we'd expect the 1 billion to consist of 500 million capex and then 500 million operational costs, which are more difficult and more elusive. I managed to get sacked for the first time in my career at age 49, when work showing the inflation of cost was leaked. The job needed doing, so how best to permit progress while putting in some challenge was a difficult path to discern. The bit I found hardest was not being sacked, but the knowledge that in creating a 1.7 billion subsidy, local authorities were cutting their social care budgets, while broadband was being funded. As an ex and indeed proud BT employee, I felt somewhat ashamed at the possibility that a minimal gap funding exercise was being gamed for cash flow. My sacking did 2 good things. One, the UK Public Accounts Committee demanded an inquiry, and then I was informed informally the clawback clauses on take-up were strengthened after I left. I've only had the latter from one source. Timing was unfortunate. Also, ministers were trying to complete the contracts prior to the Olympics. Symbolic £100,000 cabinet costs appeared in industry presentations and interviews of then CEO of Openreach in the autumn and winter of 2012-13. If BT's bid strategy was even close to reflecting this number, then 1, it would leave little room for BT's capital contribution. It would put at risk any effort to plan full fibre in rural as expected and indeed promised, and as a consequence, BT Group would be imposing some inefficient build in its network division, creating too much complexity and too many points of failure. Okay, 6 months later, in 2013, we have the first Public Accounts Committee inquiry. This was assisted with a National Audit Office report. This slide records the actual existence of a contracted BT capital contribution to allowable costs of 356 million for phase 1 activity of 4.6 million premises passed. If the programme has expanded to circa 7 million customers, then BT's capital contribution to these incremental costs must expand accordingly. This is a rare sighting of this number and very helpful to get on public record. This matter is still outstanding, but if we pursue it, then I'm convinced that a great deal more full fibre can be completed in rural areas in the coming years. The Public Accounts Committee was, I guess, quite a bit of high drama, but less in substance as MPs had not studied, in my opinion, the audit report. 11 of the 13 questions I provided were asked, and I provided that separately. The BTMD present dismissed the notion of £100,000 cabinet, acknowledged something like £29,000 for the simple components of the cabinet, but then ignored some £60,000 per cabinet fibre path budget accepted and created in the framework and evidenced actually in the annual report published before the inquiry. So we'd made some progress, gone from the £100,000 cabinet to something like a budget now for 60,000. This was the start in terms of gathering evidence. I know privately the BDUK Value for Money team found it helpful, but I was disappointed. I was separately told that KPMG had coached BT in their evidence giving before the committee. KPG and other guys were the government's procurement specialists for the contract being examined. This is the last slide from 2013. It just represents the misrepresentations, in my opinion, made to the Public Accounts Committee by BT Group in 2013. Each of these had to be unpicked. None, in my opinion, are true, and counterfactuals, if folk want them, are easy to show and illustrate. Project overall was lacking competition, and the notion that Fujitsu, who had no network at all, could force concessions is I think fanciful. And the notion that these were BT's most competitive prices was equally fanciful. We move 6 months later to BT's Q3 results. In contrast to the £100,000 a cabinet message, or now £60,000 a cabinet and fibre path, BT's then CEO was providing the opposite message to analysts pretty much at the same time. The commercial rollout was ahead of schedule and under budget. The then CEO was shortly to be appointed to the House of Lords, take up a junior minister role for trade and investment. This made my job somewhat more difficult in attempting to get matters I observed to be considered by MPs. The then Secretary of State was Maria Miller, and her authority was somewhat weakened by the expenses scandal. Okay, so this is we move on a year to February 2014. We found this is the only one and only public concession BT made to, in this case, the BBC news team. In BT's bid strategy, we were expected to accept that as the incumbent monopoly local access provider in rural areas, it would win only one contract of 44, but it would pass on efficiency if it won more. This is clearly rubbish. Fujitsu had no network. The reference to Cornwall is odd, as in the previous, as previously BT said all learnings had been built into their bid prices. This marks a small step backwards, but not enough to recalibrate the ambition. It's also worth noting that I'd submitted evidence which was not published by two select committees that year. I was getting better at writing the submissions. I did keep submitting to Ofcom consultations and audit functions in Wales and Scotland when they announced studies. Okay, so this is January 2015, a year later. The second National Audit report now found what I had already reported in 2012. Here it talks about 20% savings in SAPAC and finding 38% excess costs in BT's models. This was all available in 2012. So this was progress and good, but the ambition needed to be reset. All this talk of efficiency savings was nonsense unless the original ambition to include full fibre infill was reflected in the work packages. I did at this time make settled inquiries as to coming back to complete the job I'd helped start. But being proven right does not mean your excommunication is lifted. Normalised deviancy once it takes hold on the project is really difficult to unpick. If anything, folk get used to it and find it then much harder to change tack. Even if given the money now, accumulating would mean more work could be completed. Sajid David arrival also marked a shift away from rural to urban. Approval for a project in the Black Country would mean approving overbuild of Virgin Media, and this became widespread, in my opinion, from this point. So clawback is interesting. In the January NAA report, BDUK referred to £900,000, and May that year, the then CFO of BT referenced to a possible impact of tens of millions, not hundreds of millions. But by Q1 results reporting in August, that had leapt to 129 million, and this was all ascribed to a change in take-up from 20 to 30% take-up figures. That's a incremental growth of take-up of 10%. This number kept growing to, it's now sort of 700 million-ish. Okay. However, like the more realistic costs, these excess monies would not be applied to doing more work, which is crucial, but would accumulate and be hidden insofar as their possible impact would not be reported. Okay. This is the challenge of somebody working outside a process. You can stop what some might consider wrongdoing of sorts, but not reimpose the ambition permitted by these same funds. The official line communicated is that capital deferral is clawback arising from greater than 20% take-up. It is not the gap funding or capital I was hunting. Okay. During this time as well, John Whittingdale became SOS, and Jesse Norman became chair of the CMS Select Committee. And as soon as he became chair, he called for an inquiry into broadband. This written parliamentary question was triggered by what I considered incorrect oral evidence in the early part of the CMS inquiry into broadband. WPQs, or written parliamentary questions, are normally the most useless things imaginable. You never get a proper answer. However, in pursuing say a misrepresentation given in a set committee, you can get, if you're lucky, the written record amended over time, and in my mind at least, stop monies being going missing in the process. Here we learned that the costs that folks said were paid was changed to incurred. Incurred does not mean paid. In fact, incurred costs can be passed on for payment. This is one of a mini-series of written parliamentary questions that autumn and winter aimed at reversing the misrepresentation in the early evidence given to the CMS inquiry. You can also note that the Major Project Authority was commenting and praising the process, but in my opinion at least, not checking on the actuals. Audit functions and reports have a similar challenge, particularly if their assignments are time and resource constrained. Taking back parliamentary control is elusive. It is not clear to me, at least on this adventure, that MPs want control. Taking control might mean taking responsibility. These parliamentary inquiries is more like issuing a warning shot in the hope of reducing the abuse in exchange for avoiding a bad headline. So, the broadband USO was announced in the autumn statement in November 2015. I'm not sure how it could have been brought forward when so much money was beginning to emerge in the BDUK activity. In my opinion, this is a real problem. Unless the excess funds were going to be converted into services by the application of more resource, then politicians would lose patience and start asking for something else, having no knowledge of what was owed. The information was available to officials and available to ministers, so it's not clear how the BSO was taken seriously or ended up being legislated for. Okay, so in parallel to the Broadband Universal Service Obligation, the CMS Select Committee continued to gather evidence, and within that was more oral evidence from BT talking about £500 a premise passed, which would equate back to £100,000 cabinet at 200 premises. I wrote in with some questions, and this written evidence emerged from BT. It's more difficult to make misrepresentations in writing, as a written record is stronger, it's less subject to misunderstanding, and it's subject to, if it's wrong, it's a stronger evidence. Okay, so we have the £100,000 cabinet 2012. We spot the budget facility down to 60,000 for a cabinet and path in 2013, which is embedded in the framework, and we are 2016. We get in writing that the amount is £26,500 for a cabinet and the fibre path, although the absolute what's in this and what's included and not included is not 100%. This is good, but it should mean that more works should be contracted. But at that time, we're only seeing phase 2 work and another 900,000 premises being contracted based upon phase 1 assumptions and solutions. The ambition, unfortunately, was not being reset. That's the ambition for full fibre, and particularly in rural areas, even though large amounts of money was emerging. I believe the problem is that the commercial confidentiality clauses control the narrative based upon the 2012 gambit. Although it was being given a good kicking, the lack of any confession prevented a review such that more work and a better solution mix could be considered. There was also, in my opinion, BT's capital contribution to be gained. Okay, this is my opinion or take of what folk online christened as the BT gambit. As it was being unpicked, and it's still being unpicked, it was really being conducted at the expense of BT's own network division, its shareholders, and particularly rural customers. An internal review should have been called as soon as those second audit reports were coming in and showing the lower costs, and as soon as the clawback was rising in the manner it was. But this did not happen. It's still needed if lessons are to be learned. Questions were asked at shareholders' meetings and analyst meetings, but these were all batted away. As a BT employee or ex-employee, you can easily make the case for gaming government subsidies when faced with paying radio spectrum fees, the scale of which destroy a great deal of engineering. I should have said this earlier this is my UK broadband gospel. Forget 5G investment at the levels people really want, or finding an alternative to Huawei. When for 30 years auction yield has been Treasury's and Ofcom's priority above all other 15 priorities for the sector. This does not excuse the BT gambit or what's occurring or what has occurred, but if you look for why the behaviour was tolerated, then the gaming of spectrum auctions to optimise yield in billions of pounds is a good candidate. Both is occurring at the expense of UK infrastructure, UK's industry sector, and UK customers. Okay, so this is one final piece of evidence from the CMS Select Committee inquiry. This capital contribution slide was provided by BT after another exchange on the oral evidence. Both BT and the then Minister claimed BT had paid its capital. This table has it's got a very large forecast. Given the excesses in the budget being identified, it was my opinion there was no way BT would have the need to pay a capital contribution of this size, particularly given at that point there was about £809 million reported in state aid receipts in BT's accounts. Furthermore, I think the select committees here are ill-equipped to deal with the consequences of the truths they find. In this case, they got tired and refused further follow-up questions and rushed out a report suggesting the breakup of BT. The latter, in the manner it happened, would contribute nothing to fixing rural connectivity, which was the objective of the inquiry. Back to WPQs for me to see if the BT capital could at least be held in the process. At the very minimum, the capital deferral for clawback should be driven upwards, even if the PR stated this was for take-up. So we get a partial reversal of the BT and then minister's evidence by a new minister, who states that the department do not hold the data on BT's capital. However, we are told that there's a commitment by BT to pay it, to pay the capital. Commitment to pay can be added to the previous wordings of costs incurred. This does not suggest it's paid. It suggests but there will be a settlement at some point. I'm also convinced that there must be a record, because there's a process suggesting that investment ratios are checked. Okay, so we conclude here is that you can make misrepresentations to select committees without risk of punishment, and you can duck and dive on WPQs. So it's not at all clear to me how Parliament can get control of major procurements. I did some small piece of work in the Northern Ireland border area. Counties Fermanagh, Tyrone, Armagh have some of the worst broadband while in possession of many subsidised fibre cabinets. I did two very detailed reports were completed for the border councillors. These included DUP, UUP, Sinn Féin. It was fun, indeed a privilege, to meet and work for a short time with people forging a new future together. The evidence and conclusions were sufficiently strong to take from Omagh, Armagh, Cookstown to Stormont for the then DFE minister to make a request of DCMS for a reallocation of some of the funds now accumulating within BDUK. This request was rebuffed. From Stormont we went back to Westminster, where another slightly modified EFRA inquiry into tourism with a bit of broadband added in was kicked off in that May, where the request was repeated by then SDLP MP Margaret Ritchie. Another rebuttal by DCMS, supported by BT. DUP MPs were also members of this of the EFRA Select Committee. I took the opportunity presented by the DUP Conservative election agreement to remind DUP MPs of their hard work on broadband and the monies available in the system. I also sent a note to the NI office highlighting the zero cost of repointing monies to NI for a purpose for which the money was originally intended. Funding for rural broadband found its way into the DUP Conservative election agreement. Clearly I had no direct involvement, but you can nudge and nudge. Nudge does not pretend you're contributing anything. We are still 3 years later awaiting the outcome of Project Stratum in 2020, but when the contract is let, it will mean rural Northern Ireland will be well provisioned with full fibre. There will be no excuses if this does not happen, and it provides a template for other areas to follow. Parallel to work in Northern Ireland, the Ofcom conducted a market review for wholesale line access, which includes broadband, in 2017. I had a kind of an oral commitment or informal commitment in 2012 that Ofcom would do a catch-up on BT investment and the subsidies, so any nasties could be ironed out. It was too toxic, and Ofcom avoided the matter, although in their fair bet analysis of BT's investment, in the spreadsheets you can see tabs made by Cartesian to analyse the subsidy. This work was not completed. It's too early perhaps, and Ofcom only had an appetite to, in my opinion, to avoid the matter. I was and remain disappointed at Ofcom's total lack of interest in rural matters. The public affairs folk in Ofcom talk a story, but Ofcom's economists consider rural a wasteland, deserving of poor service because it is rural and hard to reach. This is consistent with the UK's spectrum policy for the last 30 years, where auction yield removes any moral authority to demand anything of any operator. It also reduces trust. Okay, so we're into 2019. Another written parliamentary question, another minister, and another EFRA Select Committee. Okay, so we have a same question as the money paid, same answer, slightly different answer this time. It will not diminish. That's BT's capital will not diminish, but we still have 17% of rural UK. That's 17% of 6 million customers are without upgrades, while the programme is full of funds, and work in rural is slowing down to between 6,000 to 7,000 full fibre upgrades a month. Okay, it really needs to be at about 20,000 to have any chance of finishing the job in a reasonable timescale. We also have a new descriptor. BT's capital will not diminish, so we can add that to the commitment to pay and costs incurred, and there's a few others as well. I do like working with civil servants. The money owed by BT will not diminish. That's a splendid answer. This suggests to me that there's still a good deal outstanding. The EFRA Select Committee go hunting again, and but it's unfortunate DCMS, BT, and Ofcom in their oral evidence and in their written evidence make no reference to the huge sums of monies owed and the possible impact of this on rural broadband. The location of BT's capital is raised again, as is a request to show how all the funds will be used to complete the works in rural. The various elections and machinations in Parliament have meant that the response to the report in September is still outstanding, and that is as in early February. In 2019 as well, we had North Lanarkshire inadvertently published the very information I'd gathered for BDUK in 2012. The principal components of the cabinet and fibre path were no more than £15,000 for the most part, not 100,000 or 60k. So the 26,500 that we saw earlier from the CMS Select Committee does include BT's PMO overheads and BT fees. A telephone network is built for the most part on a highly standardized basis, standard lengths, components, and maintained either equally well or equally badly. Most of the costs are predictable, so there's a high level of consistency until you reach a self-buried cable. So the propaganda and misinformation is such that folk think the job is actually done. As you can see here, if we add BT's capital contribution, which is mostly owed, I think, and the clawback, the programme is actually about £2.8 billion worth. We've probably seen half of that in terms of work. Okay, so the real success is yet to come, and we can see some of those extras now being contracted in Wales, Scotland, and hopefully Northern Ireland will be completed soon. There's even more success if the money continues to be hunted down and converted into full fibre upgrades in England. So the ambition set out in 2012 can eventually be delivered. There's no reason why it couldn't be done by 2025. Okay, so in this slide I've just extended the rollout to 2025, and as we can see, we can get to probably an intervention area of 8 million customers, even though there's only 6 million in rural UK. And we can also see we can get to about 1 million full fibre connections in very rural areas. Okay, so the upside is huge. I assume this is hard because the public relations has already been used to convey the job was finished when the interesting bit is just taking place now. 95% national coverage is only 87% rural coverage, and the job was always rural, even if rural was removed to facilitate some PR or a bonus or some other expediency. Okay. Okay, so this is one of the last slides, and really it's by means of final questions or conclusions. For government, it's really and for the department, it's simple enough. Can and will the existing monies within the program be used to complete the work started in 2012? I do think this will be the best government procurement ever if those monies are, one, reported on, and then two, converted into coverage. There's been a huge effort to dismantle that gambit. I think an equal effort now needs to just be used to complete the works possible as a consequence of dismantling that gambit. I think the question to BT, or the challenge to BT, really is to do your own review and true up. You've got all the resources in the world, all the engineering resources to do a fantastic job. I think you can just write a paper on what is possible from the remaining funds and list the lessons learned and publish the paper. Finally, this is a recommendation of Ofcom and possibly DCMS, hopefully, which is to use the AA market review in 2021 to model all subsidies and iron out any capital contributions over the process. I think it's particularly important to show transparently that BT has made a uniform capital contribution to all the projects for both FTTC and FTTP. I think we'll make a mockery of any cost recovery process unless BT's capital contributions are not just proven to be paid, but have actually been expended on the network. Okay, so I've got 2 backup slides, but I just want to thank you for listening, and I hope this is of use to anybody still waiting for an upgrade, or those working in policy or working in Ofcom trying to nudge this to its proper and good end. Thank you. Okay, so this is backup slide number 1. This is probably for mostly BT folk. I think there's been quite a significant cost to gaming the capital to BT itself, and this probably finds its form in FTTC Cure solution, where £8,000 extra was spent per cabinet, redirecting copper through cabinets, where in reality FTTP full fibre would need to be delivered beyond those cabinets anyway, because of for anybody beyond 1200 meters. So this is just an opinion, some workings for anybody looking at that. I think there are at least 8 to 10,000 incorrectly located cabinets, each of which creates added complexity cost and becomes a point of failure. Almost every single business case I wrote in BT included a session where I would be verbally beaten for daring to introduce complexity to a network where simplicity was the almost the divine rule. Full fiber is much simpler than powered cabinets. So I think in quite a few cases the appetite for subsidy, and particularly if the capital was being withheld, BT's contribution being withheld, then the solution mix could have gone wrong, and I think that's worthy of attention and to be addressed specifically in any written review and published as well. Okay, so that's one observation. One final comment on just a clawback and capital deferral. The true up, if it's conducted, will probably find that clawback is not all clawback, but includes some of the capital that folk at various times have said is paid. This needs reviewing, and the analysis needs to show my previous request for a uniform capital contribution to allowable costs. As you can see from here, the I have been unable to find a relationship between the variation in the take-up assumption and the actual clawback number in BT's accounts quarter by quarter. Okay, so you can find me on LinkedIn, Mike Kiley. Please leave comments there. This is just a draft. At this point, I'll add videos and things to sharpen this presentation up. This is my evidence and subject to judgment, your judgment. I've attempted not to judge others, which is not my business. There are bosses to be obeyed, mortgages to be paid, and work which needed to be completed, which must not be interrupted. I'm sure this highly successful project can be made much more so. And so again, thank you for your time.